We're really happy to be joining the Porto Academy for this talk. Thank you so much to Rodrigo and Amelia for inviting us. I'm Daniel Norell.
Yes, and I'm Einar Rodhe. We're a small practice in Stockholm. For the last 5 years, our studio has been in an atelier that we share together with artist Helene Schmitz. It's a place where we work, where we draw, write, make things, and so on. As the world went crazy a few months ago, we started also kind of to do teaching here remotely.
Over time, the atelier has shaped our practice in that we often end up building and photographing things beneath its large atelier window. We're constantly looking to reframe our work and our projects through different interests. Today, we would like to talk about how much of our work lately has revolved around issues of reuse, appropriation, and architecture that departs from existing objects and situations. But before going there, first a bit of background.
Taking part in exhibitions and publications has become an integrated part of our practice. It's a way for us to formulate ideas in dialogue with other practices, with theorists, curators, and other disciplines. Perhaps this is also one of the reasons why we're interested in architectural representation.
How to convey architecture across media such as drawings, photographs, texts, models, mock ups, and of course buildings. And this is one of those exhibition projects from a few years ago. Along with 12 other practices, we were invited to take part in an exhibition in Malmö that looked at small interventions for a new neighborhood. So there was kind of a local market for used goods, from vehicles to furniture to objects. It was not so much the framework provided by the structure that interested us, but the objects that would dwell in it. Together, the colorful masses of objects from a landscape form a landscape of compression and expansion, where spaces are shaped by stuff on display, a live interior constantly in production as new objects would come and go. So we imagined this market to be like a construction site, as you know, where you would pass by on a daily basis and where there's a continuous ongoing change and process. Our hope would be that unexpected adjacencies between different objects and activities would stir conversation and exchange between residents and visitors. Lately, we have also been interested in flipping the design process around. So rather than designing something on the drawing board and then being disappointed by the poor quality of standard building materials, we would first go and look for materials that have an interesting materiality and depart from them. So for this furniture project a few years ago, we started by going to the hardware store and looked for cheap standard materials that would spur our interest. So we ended up using standard leca blocks as a starting point, and in this way the project would combine the refined and the primitive. The blocks, being uncut, give the furniture pieces a set of proportions and make them appear inert, massive, and porous, which are perhaps qualities that you would not normally associate with furniture. Together, the various furniture, such as a stepped display unit, podiums, and a table, start to define a group of architectural elements. And from this work came an interest in architecture as a group of elements or masses. Our entry for the Collectio Cultural Center became an opportunity to explore this for a larger building. Fittingly, the premise of the competition was that the city of Collectio wanted to collect several existing cultural institutions into a new major hub for culture and events. And here we see the beginnings of our design, where those institutions are interpreted as basic building blocks. And here we see them assembled into our supergroup, which was the motto that we chose for the competition entry. So each building mass in the center we designed corresponded to one of the existing institutions in the town. So we can see, for instance, in green, the theater, the white rotunda for a library, and an art gallery in red, as well as a new hotel tower and a conference center. They were all arranged on a plinth that faces adjacent public spaces such as a square and a train station. This group form approach is interesting to us because it allows for multiple identities and productive adjacencies, as well as overlapping programs within the scope of one building. The project also resulted in an almost Pyrenean interior, an urban condition with junctions, piazzas, and landmarks, almost like a city consisting solely of tightly packed architecture. So this would be the first floor plan with theaters, auditoria, and foyers. We did not win the competition, but eventually the project ended up gracing the facade of Rudolph Hall at the Yale School of Architecture for the exhibition adjacencies that Nate Hume put together a few years ago.
Okay, so here are a few examples of projects that we have been working on lately. Quite a few are private residences, and several of these houses and perhaps also apartments explore a kind of playful monumentality through proportions and fenestrations. How can you make something small, like this 120 square meter house, seem big and significant? In our design, we often appreciate distinct massings, the house as an object, a readable entity in the landscape. As it says on this image, this is the house for the old chicken lady. It's a very basic structure, but with its symmetry, it has some kind of qualities that we would associate with a temple almost. And when a client asked us to replace this house with a villa, we instead proposed an extension. The new house gently touches the old, just enough to make a connection. The other thing it does is to form a series of outdoor spaces, a recessed entrance place to the street in the north and a colonnade-like facade to the west, mirroring an existing trellis structure. Here is the street facade with an old mansion in the background, to which the chicken coop once belonged. And the new house becomes a slightly larger sibling to the chicken house. Interior walls are rendered in clay, allowing for soft filleted corners. We sometimes redo apartments and interiors. This project reconfigures a 1920s apartment in central Stockholm as a central living space that extends into adjacent rooms to form a sequence. Two new sets of furnishings articulate passages and views between these rooms. On one side, the kitchen is recessed behind a bookshelf and a freestanding counter. And on the other side, a bench has sunken into the wall, creating a window that frames views between social and private spheres. A curtain may be drawn to provide privacy when wanted. Together, these spatial relations make the rooms seem spacious and varied despite their relatively modest size. Like most architects, we are often asked to do magic with no budget. This is a summer house for some friends who wanted us to or who had bought a small lot in an hour south of Stockholm. In this rural area with typical Swedish houses from the 70s and 80s, We were asked to make a small house that would transport this family to Japan. And to, as a consequence, to hide the neighbors, we proposed two walls, one actual wall to the east and one wall-like one to the, or let's say one wall-like one-sided house to the west. In between, they form the basis for a private garden. There is an open loggia to the garden and a smaller circular patio on the backside. The interior is more or less one long space, subdivided by a few volumes containing storage and wet areas, as well as subtle steps in the floor. The entrance and the kitchens, they are connected to the exterior and have tiled floors, whereas other areas lie one step up, with a wooden floor on which shoes aren't allowed, and the raised floor contains storage, cables, tatami mats, etc. The exterior has a rhythm of posts and rafter trails, against which there is a play of larger openings. This house has just been finished, and we will go there next week to have some photos taken. And making this kind of houses, to us, it's a kind of ongoing work in progress. And we enjoy designing single family houses, as it's often a sort of quick process, but where one potentially can kind of pack a lot of architecture in a small envelope. Yeah, here's some shots taken with the phone.
So what we thought we would do is to go through a few projects in more detail. And for some time now, we have been interested in how architecture can come about by collecting, altering, and recombining existing things. This is something we have explored over a range of projects and that we would like to dwell on. And it has to do with our interest in the representation of architecture, how one can harvest and mediate qualities of existing things and buildings through means of representation. So essentially it's things that start from other things. So in this first project, Dead Ringers, we started from an interest in Stockholm's smallest buildings like phone booths, restroom kiosks and photo booths. And this came naturally for us because we're based in Stockholm, so we move around here a lot. So these urban kiosks are rapidly being removed because they're outmoded. So you can most of them you can no longer find on the city's streets and squares. And so we started also documenting the range of kiosks and booths in Stockholm based on photographs as well as archive drawings. And over time we became obsessed with the anthropomorphic proportions of these figurative buildings. So just to take a few examples, at the turn of the last century, some of the kiosks featured shingle-clad pitched roof and slender legs, while more recent ones are more monolithic with rectilinear volumes made from formed metal panels and glass. What ties them all together, despite stylistic differences, is the fact that they all have been shaped around the human body. So those drawings were then used as a starting point for the design of a set of new, strange copies of the kiosks that would replace the disappearing ones. Our Dead Ringers, like the original booths, would be visible as small characters in the urban fabric. But unlike their ideally proportioned forefathers, they would be disfigured, lopsided, and weirdly postured. Eventually, some of this work that we had produced without knowing what to do with it led to an invitation from Archdes, the National Center for Architecture and Design in Sweden. They were putting together their first exhibition under the directorship of Kieran Long. Titled Public Luxury, the exhibition gathered large-scale commissions, installations, and projects that tell stories about the struggle for public life. And what this meant was also that we took a step from smaller models and scale studies in our studio to working with the manufacturer and to produce a one-to-one kiosk. And here are just a few shots from the exhibition at Arctes that reveals one of the kiosks that the installation was composited from. And we kind of like the fact that in some views, part of the overall form seems to fall into the projection plane of the facade, whereas other parts of the form break out or twist out of the very same plane. So overall, the project is a play between 2D elevation or frontality and three-dimensional mass. Here's a shot from the opening night, and we quite like this view of the dead ringer standing as a majestic figure in a sea of smaller people. For a brief moment, the dead ringer also stepped out from the museum and into the urban fabric of Stockholm. This is another type of project, a research project that's still work in progress. It's supported by the Swedish Research Council, and we're doing it in association with friends and colleagues at the KTH Stockholm, who also run the practice Brum.
I mean, perhaps one should mention that this is a collaboration between the KTH in Stockholm and Konstfack, which is the other school in the city where I teach.
Yeah, and the project started out by laser scanning domestic interiors and all the stuff contained in them, so things like furniture, objects and belongings of the inhabitants. So based on the scans, we put together a series of drawings where floor, walls and ceiling were clipped away, so that the room could be viewed without its architectural framework. We were interested in what these kinds of drawings would reveal about the interior that's not revealed in standard modes of architectural representation, such as CAD drawings. And what was interesting was that when you scan, the scanner does not make a distinction between architecture, furniture and objects. So a small item like a vase gets the same amount of attention as something that belongs to the architecture, such as the window niche. In this way, we documented several identical living rooms in an apartment building in central Stockholm. And these drawings reveals how the interior, unlike the exterior of a building, is constantly in production through the arrangement of stuff. In some rooms, it was as if the walls had become encrusted with stuff, so that the architecture seemed to almost disappear behind it. So it was you get a sense of space that's almost shaped entirely by the objects. Based on the scans, we're also doing a series of line drawings that takes the hyperrealism of the scan and subjects it to the conventions of architectural drawing. These drawings emphasize the limitations of the technology by omitting walls and other surfaces that the scanner has not been able to get a clear view of. And that's why we can see that the outline of the room becomes jagged as it intersects with objects. So a bookshelf, for example, abstracts the wall behind it. Or in this elevation view, the sofa merges with the floor and the wall for the same reasons. And it was fascinating to see how different the sense of the space of the room was in the different apartments, depending of course on how they were furnished and what kinds of objects was found in them. So here are just a few more drawings from the project. Another set of drawings took a closer look at agglomerations of stuff. And these drawings documented in isometric view with clipped sections, so that hierarchy, adjacency and continuity between objects was revealed. This might, for instance, allow us to understand the book and the shelf that it sits on, or similarly the pillow and the sofa that it sits on, as an assembly and as a new whole, and ultimately as a new kind of architectural entity. These kinds of drawings allow us to see everyday objects and situations with fresh eyes, and maybe as the starting point for other designs and projects.
Okay, so one thing we find fascinating is how repurposed or appropriated objects get a new significance as they're altered or removed from their original context. To the left, we have the ancient practice of spolia, where architectural elements are transplanted or creatively kind of reused in new structures. And as one might notice, the circular drums in this wall once formed columns in a Greek temple. And a more contemporary example of reusing and assembling found objects would be Martino Gamper's 100-share project. Both these examples are interesting to us since their designers seem to have taken found objects, examined them partly without preconceptions, and assembled them into new difficult wholes. We got an opportunity to play with spolia and reuse conceptually when we were invited to participate in a small exhibition in Italy. For the exhibition, each invited practice was asked to interpret a chapter from Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. And given our interest in spolia, we choose the chapter on Claris, a city that Calvino describes as being continuously remodeled by shuffling around the same building elements over and over again. And when doing this quick model, we wanted to situate us in Claris, where you're only allowed to build with already used elements. So we went on a scavenger hunt in our studio, collecting the smallest and most beautiful items. So in The Invisible Cities, Calvino writes, "The capitals could have been in the chicken runs before they were in the temples. The marble urns could have been planted with basil before they were filled with dead bones. Only this is known for sure. A given number of objects is shifted within a given space, at times submerged by a quantity of new objects, at times worn out and not replaced. The rule is to shuffle them each time, and then try to assemble them." For the last year's Architecture Triennale in Oslo, we developed a project called Under Construction, where we, inspired by the Calvino text, imagine a 100% kind of reused city that is neither dystopic nor futuristic. The project is a kind of playful fiction with immediate ties to the grit of the real world, where the city becomes an archive of stuff, continuously transforming in slow motion as building elements are reused in new buildings. For the project, we wanted to understand where building elements go when buildings come to an end. A demolition worker told us that today only building elements that either are really old, let's say 100 years plus, or very young, let's say 5 years, are valued. Patina and craftsmanship are interesting, and on the other hand, being fresh is valuable. But the rest, what makes up most of the buildings around us, has today kind of no real value once its components are being deinstalled. And here's a landfill south of the city where building elements and other waste materials are buried deep underground. It once was a strip mine, and now this wound in the landscape is being concealed gradually with garbage. And the waste here is protected with a waterproof layer below, and it will be above at the end, like kind of wrapped in gift to future generations. And giving building elements a second life is today a logistical challenge, a problem of codes, material flows, and logistics. But as architects, we realize that it's as much a cultural and designerly problem. We are trained to consider abstract space before objects and materials, and building elements and furnishings should be subservient to a larger whole. And if you think about it, this approach is aligned with the view on the world that is inherited from industrialism, in which any materials could be sourced anew and molded into shape indefinitely. Reuse is interesting to us as a conceptual approach to architecture, where the starting point is a specific and limited stock of elements and chunks of materials. Here's an image from our atelier, a taxonomy of building elements and materials we had gathered for the project. And each piece of material comes with a set of qualities, a character that may be amplified, subverted, or altered. By improvising and playing with this scale of kit of parts, or playing with the scale of this kit of parts, we started to imagine entire buildings constructed from reused materials. Here, plasterboard becomes concrete slabs, a grand theater made out of porcelain. Each building consists of only one material, one fraction, to use recycling terminology. Together, the buildings form a fictional neighborhood with streets and plazas. As many of you may know, the Triennale was themed the architecture of degrowth, where Interbang, the curators, explore the idea of degrowth, to limit the endless extraction of materials and natural resources. How does architecture respond to that in terms of models of practice, aesthetics, urban life, etc.? To us, this project has been an opportunity to rethink our practice and to kind of prepare ourselves for future shifts in the field of architecture and design.
All right, so we wanted to end this talk with a recent project that touches upon parts of this thinking, but in a much more casual way. So probably if you look close enough, very few buildings are static. They are constantly changing. And here is an example of that, an historical survey of an old Navy building in Stockholm. It was built as a small single-level storage building in the early 18th century, which can be seen here in dark gray, and since then it has grown gradually in all directions in lighter and lighter gray. We like this building and we feel for the building as it tries to look proud and proper as one whole, but if you pay attention, you see conflicts and negotiations all over. And the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm asked us to transform the ground floor of this building into their new home for students and faculty working with photography, moving images, and performance art.
Our transformation treats the building as a found object, and the design aims at turning old accidents, let's say, into architecture. So, in this example, someone once added a support structure as the building was growing vertically. I mean, going back to this image, I think this was somewhere in the sort of midst of 19th century. And someone added this support structure with kind of braced timber posts placed just in front of the windows. And this drawing shows how we have inserted a new partition wall just behind this support structure to kind of create seminar rooms, and how this wall becomes a backdrop for the post, projecting the window layout of the front facade onto it, just kind of to show this kind of strange relationship between the new posts and the existing building, let's say. Yeah, and the design transformed the buildings through a limited number of smaller adjustments rather than budget and material intense alterations. And we started this project with an inventory of spaces as well as of other hidden resources at the Institute. To the left is one of the timber posts again, before construction, which we kind of wanted to unclutter and emphasize. And the image in the middle shows a set of beautiful chairs in the school's extensive warehouse, once designed for the students' atelier back in the days when the majority of students still were kind of painting on canvases. And scouting the institute, we also found an old stonework that could kind of be reused as a table.
So most of these images from the project were taken by our friend Mikael Olsson just before the school opened. And being an art school, the rooms are now gradually transforming beyond our control and are filled with artworks, many of them. The project responded to a new, less hierarchical model for art education that were in development at the institute when we started. And this model meant that faculty, students, and workshop staff were to be grouped around the subject of study, like photography, animation, moving images, rather than based on academic rank. This is a faculty and student lounge, a loosely programmed space for spontaneous work, lunches, coffee, conversation. And in fact, social spaces like this, where students and faculty were to meet and have spontaneous conversations, were an important part of the brief. For the project, we designed a series of furniture pieces that were specially made, including this greenish concrete table.
Adjacent to the lounge is a kitchenette in stainless steel and a shelf that was kind of tailored to the timber post. And in general, circulation spaces without daylight were painted in a darker hue. And here we can see the student lockers in yellow particle board. Whereas sort of other spaces like here, it's the library and combined with a project room in a kind of brighter color. And this is basically kind of a large atelier for group work where students have their own shelf and can kind of work several days in a project together.
Apart from the timber posts, there were also other elements from the Navy era that we could integrate into design. So for instance, in the project room, there was an overhead crane that became part of the design. And with curtains drawn in the project room, the space becomes a movie theater for screenings. So in some of the rooms, like this room, we opted for flexibility through movable furniture and other solutions. But in other spaces, it was key to stick to something more robust that could not be moved at all, such as the concrete table. So overall, one might say that the project had to negotiate flexibility as well as order. And here is the teacher's office, faculty office, with another custom designed furnishing a vitrine for books and belongings.
There were also a lot of spaces for production, such as kind of computer rooms, digital dark rooms, video editing rooms, and a kind of film and animation studio. And these spaces are all neutrally colored. And here, finally, the space kind of filled with people. It's a shot from the inauguration with faculty, students, and guests gathered around the big table. Yeah, I think in a way this was the last slide. So thank you everyone for having us.
Thank you.
All right.